paradigm with the core framework of legalized aggression narratives. So the framework for legalized aggression and lawfare. So for my methods for this theory, this is like my first time doing something like this. I hadn't had any formal theory class, so I had to self-teach myself all these different theories, what's out there, what isn't out there, and learn about it and do my best. So for this theoretical synthesis, this is all based on the combination of the major IR paradigms of constructivism, realism, and institutionalism. These are the last three major, widely accepted major theories within the field of international relations and political science. This is done to form the foundations of narrativism and legalized aggression narratives. So constructivism incorporates how social norms, ideas are used to help shape the influences and perceptions of the people. Realism is the kind of why institutions, governments narrate aggression into legality. So trying to strive for more power is the common term I use, and which is one of the core definitions of realism. And institutionalism is the structure itself that is created to support institutions, their frameworks. So like the United Nations having the UN Charter, the US having the US Constitution and our Bill of Rights, those kind of documents. So the development of LAN as a diagnostic tool and sub-theory actually started before I discovered narrativism as a broader paradigm for it all. Because after building LAN, I discovered that this applies to media, this applies to judicial review, this applies to health, business, ecological policies, etc., and history. Essentially what narrativism does is, through LAN, it identifies rhetorical mechanisms used to legitimize aggression. This will eventually be expanded as I explore more of the other areas like history, peace, judicial, etc. I have also formally created a program that will test this. Later you'll see one of the outputs from an analysis of said program. It tests 5 of the 6 tropes. I designed it before writing the theory, and I discovered the 6th trope, right suppression, later on. So my rhetorical and institutional analysis comes down to applying close reading, discourse, legal text, policies, UN resolutions, the whole 9 yards from international down to state, local levels, policy documents, institutional communications, and I also utilize my program to kind of parse through and scan these legal texts that are publicly available. So everything I utilized was publicly accessible. I had access to, no copyright infringement. I ensured I abided by policies when reviewing. For the case study selection, I decided to focus on Ukraine, Gaza, Yugoslavia, and Indiana's own House Enrollment Act 1001, yes, that changed the Board of Trustees for IU. My program and throughout my analysis reveals that there are potential violations, constitutional rights violations under the right suppression for the First and 14th Amendment. For Ukraine, I'll kind of outline these more later, but all these case studies have relevance to domestic and international issues going on today that need to be solved. The narrative pattern identification, essentially coding recurring tropes across institutional language across 6 categories. So those categories are going to be right suppression, institutional deflection, historical justification, sovereignty framing, security and protection rhetoric, and legal legitimation. And I'll get into those shortly. So narrativism itself, the architecture of legitimacy. Narrativism, as I said earlier, reframes international relations to being structured itself by strategic narratives. Institutions aren't just acting, they're narrating. Legitimacy is performed through language, law, and institutional design. So consider the USSR for a moment. The USSR collapsed. We still don't really know exactly why it collapsed. We know there's a significant economic hardships. We know there's social unrest. We know wars. All the Cold War itself contributed to this. But we don't know exactly why the government itself fell apart. Through LAN and narrativism, it shows how, through the economic collapse that the USSR was experiencing at the time, the people were losing faith and trust in their government. What the government was saying was different to what people were living. As such, the narrative began to break down, and as the narrative broke down, the people looked for something new. Because when you're not being protected, when your rights are being violated, when you can't live your life, people are going to look for something new that would do that. And so all of this led to accumulating of events that would eventually see the USSR's collapse and the rise of a new government with a slightly new narrative for the benefit of the people. Once the people lose faith, the people will look to replace. Narrativism will analyze how stories are shaped through power, policy, and perception. This chart here, kind of the breakdown, starts with narrativism with legalized narratives. Then it goes down through the tool and subtheory of legalized aggression narratives. I've combined Clausewitz's Trinity plus perception. So his Trinity includes people, government, and military. This is a common use within history, political science, which kind of shapes how we understand and decipher institutions and current day politics, history, etc. And I added perception because perception then accounts for the narrative itself, how people review and how people react to the narratives that the institutions create. Constructivism, ideas, norms, and the narrative itself, realism, power, institutionalism, structure, and design. All of these combine form land, which helps decipher these narratives in a way that people can use to hold governments and institutions accountable, from the international, from the UN, all the way down to our local governments. So again, land, the diagnostic tool within narrativism, revealing how institutions use legality to normalize aggression and coercion. Because I argue here, law is not always neutral. It's assumed that way. The consensus is law is neutral because it has to be to represent everybody equally, but law doesn't represent everybody equally. It also is a mechanism for governments to use more power, more than what they have. So Russia used it, for example. Russia used the claim that NATO buildup at their borders justified increasing military action in certain regions, they annexed Crimea and Ukrainian territories, claiming they're protecting Russian nationals, and it's what the people of those regions voted for. That was their international and national claim that justified their aggressive actions. Some of these instances show where multiple narrative tropes can apply. This is kind of the coding schema that I've mentioned. So for legal legitimation, law is used to justify aggression and action, sovereignty framing, defense and national interest in sovereignty, historical justification, past trauma or events are invoked for justifying current action, security and protection are protection and security narratives, so like drone strikes to protect your national sovereignty or your people. Institutional deflection, essentially, it's simple, blame is shifted to a process or another entity. And rights suppression, rights are rhetorically protected material and restricted for people. So historical foundations come from the League of Nations, the United Nations, and the UN Charter. The League failed to narrate peace, as such they fell to the collapse because they had no enforcement power to enforce their narrative. The UN has succeeded because they have an enforcement power, but it's affected by institutional gridlock. And the UN Charter itself says we the peoples, but that is a narrative itself because it's not really we the peoples. The permanent five, the US, UK, Russia, France, and China have permanent veto power. So really, if you don't have them on board, everything fails. So it's not we the people, it's really we the world powers. So I had the case studies of Russia, the Ukraine war. That's the one I'm going to focus for a moment on. Well, I already discussed that one actually. So Israel and Gaza. So they have security, rhetoric, right suppression, historical justification, and legal legitimation. They've justified in self-defense. Yes, valid under international law, but then they continue to use that as justification, when to get their hostages back, so on, to continue to justify aggression. They shifted blame onto Gaza as well. Yugoslavia, the UN permitting NATO airstrikes for protecting their troops and trying to maintain peace, but nothing was happening, so they wanted to bomb artillery and stuff that caused greater violence. And I already explained for Indiana's AGA 1001. Constructivism has builds from legitimacy, socially constructive through the social norms and ideas, like I mentioned. Power drives strategic narrative, establishment procedures obscure coercion and narrative. Aggression for institutionalism, all of these, like I said, creates an operational framework within that. The implications. Lawfare is not just a military tactic, but a narrative system. Institutions narrate legitimacy to mask origin, both with and without knowledge of doing so. With land as a tool, a new form to diagnose and hold institutions accountable can be created. And humanity really builds the institution. The institution builds the story, the institution changes the story, and humanity begins to believe the new. When they lose faith, the story crumbles. When the story crumbles, the narrative collapses. When the narrative collapses and its legitimacy falls, in turn leading to the creation of a new institution by humanity. This is my test study example from my program that I had mentioned earlier. Not all of the tropes are in here because, again, I programmed it before I discovered rights suppression. So security and protection rhetoric, this is valuable because the Ronan Bishop versus IU lawsuit. He's explaining his rights have been violated. Legal legitimation, the having 21 is great. It's because he's citing legal precedent. So future research opportunities, I mentioned these areas of expansion before: historic narratives, health narratives, ecological narratives, and peace. Each of these and land itself form a new concept in which claims law is not neutral, rather framed in a neutral manner that makes it seem neutral. This has implications, hypothetical changes, in how we study law, policy, reform, and legitimacy. So really the new challenge is aggression is what law and humanity narrate can be. So how do we determine that? How do we justify that and diagnose it? I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Andy Tucholsky, my mentor, who kind of helped guide me through and encourage me to write the formal research, the IUURC organizers, for putting all this together. I can cook with faculty and staff who helped me revise and move forward and work through me, including all my advisors over there, and my family and friends who are here with me today. And these are some of my selected references through Alexander Wentz's constructivism. He's the one who foundationalized, cemented that theory within the field in 1999. There's not actually been a new major theory accepted since then. And then, of course, UN documents, historical accounts, and the other theories as well.
Very good. We probably have time for like a couple questions.
Did you draw exclusively from international studies and political science for your lit review?
Not completely. I also applied some domestic, like for the Indiana House Enrollment Act. I did utilize that for kind of more for the right suppression because that's where it was most prevalent, based on how I've got it perfect coded. That it's easier to analyze and define and find the right suppression in domestic cases than it is in international law, because of the simple fact that in international they have to be much more balanced and neutral in their language.
I ask because your work on the institutional narratives reminds me a little bit of what sociologist Matthew Desmond does in his work with wildfire fighters, in terms of what happens when there's a death of a firefighter working on the front lines. And so that might be a piece of lit to look into because of simply just how he frames those two types of institutional narratives that arrive or derive from those kinds of episodes.
Thank you for pointing that out. I'll definitely look into it.
Any other questions here? Well, I think we're coming into the difficult scenario of having such amazing presentations that we're running out of time for questions and all these good things. So I have a million questions for you as well, but I think I'm going to have to keep it moving because that's my job. So let's chat later.
And I can give my email out if anybody would like to send me some more questions.
Yeah, very good.